Welcome back to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today we're taking a look at part 2 of our quite in-depth look at Bold Endeavour from Stargrave. We've already had a look at the new captain and first mate backgrounds which have been introduced in this supplement. We've had a look at the new soldier or crew types, and we've gone over the new starship rules for in your games. In the second part, we're going to have a look at the different scenarios, the new loot, and the aliens that this supplement covers. There are 5 new scenarios in Bold Endeavour, 4 of them which are multiplayer and 1 of them which is solo. The first scenario, the Crystal Caves of Caveth, or Caveth, is set on a planet in caves which are full of crystals. So this one's got some quite interesting game mechanics in it, whereby if you miss somebody with a shot, then it has the potential to hit a crystal and bounce off in a random direction, either coming back at yourself, straight into the ceiling, causing part of it to collapse down on top of somebody, or off at a different random angle across the table. This scenario also introduces the first of our new alien species, which is in this one, string life. String life are a really strange alien life form which are essentially a string of crystals held together by a kind of wire, which really makes them really easy to model in your games. You're just going to need some wire and some beads, which is really good because one of the problems that we find with Stargrave, particularly with the expansions, is that you are going to need a lot of models for them. So the easier they are to make for you, the better. For this particular scenario, you're going to need 1 string life per player, and then you have the potential of adding 1 on every turn. The standout feature for string life is if they are reduced to 0 hit points, then they actually split in half, and then each of those halves has full health again. Once those halves are reduced to 0, then they're off the board. But it does mean you're going to need some big string life and some small one. If we're playing a 6-turn game, you are therefore going to potentially need 8 large string life and 16 small ones, which is quite a few, but as I said, they should be easy to make, so they're not really a major problem in this. I do like the bouncing shots in this scenario though, so it is quite interesting. Scenario 2, Psychic Screams. This has essentially got a pool of water set up in the center of your table with 9 different containers or pods within it, which all contain alien life forms which are being experimented on by Chafin or Chaffin. So in this one, the pool that the pods are in acts as rough terrain, and the pods themselves have the potential of being broken and releasing the aliens that are inside them. On the very first turn, and every time that a pod is cracked and something is released, a psychic scream is given out, and essentially you're going to take damage from that and be reduced to only having 1 action, as if you're stunned. When pods crack open, inside them you're going to find a random alien, and this is where I find problems with Stargrave, is the number of aliens you're potentially going to need before you can actually start a game. So when a pod cracks, you roll a dice, and on a 16, 17, 18, 19 or 20, you are going to replace that pod with a different kind of alien. Now, given that there are 9 pods, you're going to have the potential of having 9 aliens on the table. But with each of those aliens being able to be one of 5 different types, you're going to have 9 times 5 or 45 different aliens prepped and ready before playing this scenario, but then you're only going to actually use 9 out of those 45, and maybe not even that. So if you're playing this scenario as written, then it's going to be problematic. You're going to have to change some of these rules in most likeliness, maybe possibly just go for 1 species of alien which is within those pods, so that you only have to have 9 of them rather than 45. This is the only scenario that Arson Driders appear, Ursurix appear, and Vinamon appear. The Living Lightning or the String Life, they appear in other scenarios, but these other 3 alien species, which are written just for this book, only appear in this scenario. And that's particularly strange because you're going to have to use some of these aliens in other games or other scenarios that you make up yourself in order to get the full use of them. What I mean by that, for example, is a Vinamon here, which only appears in this scenario, which happens deep down in caves with lots of barren, rocky terrain with bits of technology about it. They have got special powers which help them blend in with shrubbery and plant life. But in this scenario, then there isn't any, so they completely miss out on that main feature which they've been written. So it would have been really nice to see a scenario which actually has plant life and shrubbery in it, written in order to use Vinamon effectively. Scenario number 3 is a bit of an odd one. This has only got one new alien type of life, which is the Living Lightning, but that hardly ever actually appears. It's only going to appear on a 19 or 20 roll at the end of turns when you are moving loot, which we'll come back to later. The main thing about this scenario is that it's the first kind in Stargrave which is being played in a large 3-dimensional space in order to try to represent a zero gravity atmosphere. This scenario has heavily been inspired by the fight training in the movie Ender's Game, and we know that for a fact because of this line, "the gate is down," which is prominent in that movie. This scenario though is going to take a lot of prep before you actually play it, and you're going to need a lot of different things. We've got lots of spheres which are essentially floating around in this zero gravity, and they're going to move up and down and bounce off of each other. So in order to represent that, you're going to have 9 4-inch diameter spheres, and you're going to have some different stands which they can stand on. 3 of those spheres are going to be at ground level, 3 of them are going to have to be on stands 2 inches above the ground, and 3 of them are going to be on stands 4 inches above the ground. You're also going to need stands for your figures. You're going to have 3-inch stands and 6-inch stands, and you're going to need to have a lot of them so that each figure can move up and down and could be on any of those stands. And then you're going to need 3-inch stands for each of the 5 loot tokens, and you're going to need some 5 hatches. So just in terms of stands needed, this is going to be a bit of a tricky one. You're going to want to use some kind of cubes or blocks, potentially cheap Jenga blocks from a charity shop or thrift shop, or things like Multilink or any other kind of children's toy for preschoolers. I think this has got a lot of potential as a game format, but I'd be really interested to hear if anybody actually plays this, and I'm not sure if this has actually been play tested. This is definitely one I would like to try, but I'm going to have to get myself a lot of stands before I can do anything with this. Scenario number 4, the last of our multiplayer scenarios, is on a planet full of giant trees which suck water up from the ground through their roots, and that causes lots of ripples or surface waves. And in this, the ground is going to essentially move across the way, and it's going to go from a random table edge to the opposite table edge, and that's going to pick up everybody who's not standing on top of something. Anyone who's in contact with the surface is going to get moved if they fail their move roll. So it has a lot of potential for some interesting encounters and people dropping loot, because if you get moved you leave the loot behind, so it could really vary gameplay and change things up a bit. The alien species in this are click-clacks. You're going to need 5 click-clacks at startup and then potentially 3 every turn. So in a 6-turn game then you're going to need 23 of these things, which is a lot of model for something which is really specifically described and it's not very generic. Most difficult thing with representing this alien species in miniatures though is that they can join together to form a larger, more powerful mass. So if you wanted to actually represent this exactly on your game board, you're going to have to somehow come up with models which can actually join together. Whether that's some kind of physical system or magnetic interlinking, I don't know, but it really is an interesting idea. I think for practicalities for gameplay, you're going to have your individual models, but also one model which represents an amalgam of click-clacks and just change the stats on that one larger model rather than actually physically adding your individual models to it. But I would be really interested to see or hear what people come up with for that. Our last scenario in this book, scenario number 5, the Plasmonic Hitchhikers. This is our solo one, and it's essentially on the outside of your spaceship. There are 4 plasmonic life forms. That's it. This is going to be an easy one to model. You're only going to need 4 miniatures for it. Essentially, they're trying to feed off of your ship, and you're going to have to go out and clear them off of the ship before your ship takes damage. And if you're using the spaceship rules from this supplement, then your spaceship, you are actually going to have to change the stats on your spaceship depending on how long this scenario goes on for. This is definitely the easiest of the scenarios to model, and in that case, I think it's actually my favourite out of these, just because it's actually more likely to be played. With the scenarios done, we then move on to advanced technology, alien artifacts and ship upgrades. All expansions have new advanced technology, and on this one we have got 18 new things. 6 of them turn out to actually be essentially ship upgrades, so if you're trying to use them without using these ship rules, they'd be no good to you. But the other 12 items are pretty interesting things, like solid slugs, which can actually physically move somebody once they've been shot, or spacer boots, which help you to stay in place, which is particularly going to be useful in the surface wave scenario in this book. There are 20 alien artifacts, and all of these essentially enhance the powers already possessed by your captain or first mate. So if you're rolling on this table randomly to see if you can pick one of these, most of these are not going to be useful to you unless you have that particular power. So although they're definitely useful to captains and first mates with that power, the chances of getting the one that you need for your captain or first mate on a random roll are quite slim, so you're more likely to benefit from alien artifacts from some of the other supplements. And then of course we've got some ship upgrades which you can buy, which really are useful only for this particular supplement, because they're just going to change some of the stats on what you're doing when you are recording how much damage your ship has taken. Or you're going to take some of your specialist soldiers and change them to standard soldiers instead, so that you can essentially have more specialists. Our bestiary covers all of the new aliens that are in here. We've got our arson drider, which is our camel alien, which essentially is made from arsenic, so it is toxic. And the special feature on this one is that it has a movement of 7 if it's moving twice, or if it's doing 2 different actions, then its movement goes down to 5. This one only appears in a pod in that Psychic Screams scenario though. The click clacks that join together, there is lots of information here for them because they move differently from other random encounter aliens. They have a different priority in that they want to join together to form a bigger mass which is more powerful and more deadly to you. We've got the living lightning, which really is basically it's the lightning gremlin from Gremlins 2. And this, because it has a body made from energy, is going to take much less damage when it's shot or attacked by anything. Our plasmonic life forms, which attack the outside of your ship, because they're made from plasma, they can squeeze through any size gap at all. They can also shoot out energy beams, I suppose. And sometimes when they die, you're going to roll and see if they actually contain loot, because they swallow things up, a bit like gelatinous cubes in Dungeons and Dragons, so you might find actual useful things inside them once they're dead and off the table. The Chafin from the Psychic Screams scenario, they essentially look like feathers, so they would be pretty weird looking but quite easy to model, I suppose. We've got our string life here, which are able to divide and get smaller ones. And we've got our Ursuric, which basically is a bear with scorpion tails coming out of its shoulders, so that if it is in close contact fighting with somebody, it's going to pierce them with that, and that's going to cause toxic reactions in people. It's also going to pick up other players and give them a really strong bear hug and crush their bodies. And then this guy here, he is a Vinemon, which, as I said, it blends in with other plant life, which means that in this book it doesn't actually benefit from that at all. There's no point in this book as written in that particular ability. So you are going to have to use this in your own scenario of your own made up game if you want it to actually benefit from the ability that it has. These guys are vulnerable to fire, but they do have primitive weapons that they can attack with. There's not very many new attributes, but I've just basically gone over them already. The main focus of Bold Endeavour is giving you those new starship rules, new crew type which go along with those starship rules, and of course new technology and ship upgrades which go along with those rules. But as I said in my last video, the rules for starships don't actually affect your actual war games on the table. There's nothing in here apart from calling in a spaceship to land in order to evacuate one of your members of crew or some of them. There's not really much of anything in here about actually using spaceships in your games. So for that, this for me has to be the weakest of the expansions. Now, I love Stargrave, and as you saw in the last video, I've got all of the expansions, but for me, this one, it just doesn't particularly do it. The new scenarios are interesting, particularly looking forward to trying to figure out a good way of doing that 3-dimensional anti-gravity one with the floating spheres. And I do like the click clacks which come together. Interested in seeing how I'm going to actually physically manifest that on the table. I do really like the exosuit as a new soldier or crew type. It's got some good abilities, and there's some nice models that I've got that really would look fantastic for this. So I'm quite interested and excited about having a reason to paint those up and use them in a game. But for me personally, I'm unlikely to use these spaceship rules much, and so most of this doesn't really apply to me. I'm not a huge fan of the random encounter tables for different alien species because it does, as I said, mean that you have to have a lot of different types prepped before a game, which you're maybe never going to use any of, or just a couple of them. So as far as miniatures go, I prefer not to have that kind of scenario and setup. So in future expansions, I'm hoping that there's going to be less of that. For me anyway, if there are any of the Stargrave expansions you can give a miss on, it's going to be this one. I am though looking forward to seeing what Joseph McCulloch does with a full, proper expansion, book-size version of Dead or Alive. And I will look forward to that coming out later on, probably at the beginning of next year. Well, I hope that's been useful to you and helped you to make up your mind whether or not this expansion is for you and whether you should buy it. We'll be back next time with more vintage board games. So until then, this is Attic Raiders Retro Reviews.